and welcome to the first episode, you might want to call it, of The Analysts with Jake Novak. Now, luckily, by coincidence, my name is Jake Novak, so I'm perfect for this show. But in all seriousness, I know I'm not a household name, but just a little bit about me. I've been a TV news executive producer at many of the networks you know, CNN, Fox, CNBC, for about 30 years. But I've also been an editorial columnist and an analyst, and I spent 2 years on the other side working almost in public relations because I was the media director for the Israeli consulate in New York City, working to get a message out on television news shows, which is why I really look at making messaging and communicating with the public from an analytical point of view. Sure, I have my biases. Sure, I have my political leanings. Anyone who says they don't is lying. But that doesn't stop me from looking at good communications, whether it's coming from my side or someone else's side, and looking at bad communications, whether it's coming from my side or someone else's side, and calling it for what it is. Now, the format of this program, many of you, if you're a sports fan, you'll know what I'm talking about. But if you're not, if you turn on the TV on any Sunday morning during the NFL season, you'll start seeing network after network that has an amazing number of analytical shows looking at the sports games. And let me tell you something, the folks on those shows are biased. A lot of them are fans of a particular team or fans of a particular player, but they don't let that bias get in their way of not only good analysis as far as in-depth is concerned about why a team lost a game or won a game, or why a team may or win or may lose a game, but they don't let those biases get in the way of the fact that they can't get around the fact of praising something that's good or praising something that's bad. And again, most importantly, it's in-depth adult level coverage. In the United States today, and I don't think many of you will disagree with me, we have graduate school level analysis in our sports preview shows and sports post-game shows, and fifth grade or lower than that analysis of our political campaigns and political candidates on our television news channels. Now, again, a lot of you might think that the problem with our political coverage in this country is partisanship, and that definitely plays a role. It's definitely too far to the left often, and too much rooting for the leftward team on the MSNBCs and CNNs of the world. There's a lot of rooting for the right wing and Republicans, of course, on the Foxes and Newsmaxes of the world. I don't think that that's a crime, especially when you know what you're getting when you tune into those channels. But the real problem for both of those kinds of networks is it's nothing more than that, really, most of the time. You don't get real analysis. You don't get a look at what works and what doesn't work. And this is part and parcel of our political consulting industry in this country, which I use that term lightly because I don't really know if they're doing a lot of real consulting. The problem with political consultants in this country, and I'll be very blunt, they're not very good at what they do. And I mean the real professional outfits. I'm not talking about someone who is advising someone on how to dress or talk every once in a while. I'm talking about the big political consulting firms in Washington, D.C. I don't think they're good at what they do. And further than that, I really don't think they're the greatest people either. But here's the problem. They work in an industry where no matter how bad a job they do, in every election, half of them are going to win and half of them are going to lose. And so they are allowed to live under the illusion that they're batting at least 500. And if you're a baseball fan, but that's a pretty good average. I think that they're doing a much better job than they really are doing. Now compare that, for example, for those of you who remember the dot-com bomb. Hey, we all know the Amazons of the world and everything else like that did great. But for every Amazon, there were like dozens of internet companies that failed. The free market filtered out the chaff for the wheat from the chaff. But we don't have that in political consulting. And that's one of the reasons why our campaigns and our candidates, in my opinion, and I think probably if you're watching this, you agree, have gotten worse and worse over the years. The messaging has become more and more juvenile. It's not just about somebody like Donald Trump being more blunt, or George W. Bush before him not being a great speaker, or Joe Biden right now having a hard time being in any way coherent. This trend was going on for a long time. We were allowing people to get away with it for a really, really long time. And I think it needs to stop. If you're worried and you're upset about the state of our government in this country and its ineffectiveness, don't look any further than the way that they campaign, the people who are in government, the way that they campaign, if you're trying to figure out the reason why. And that leads me to the goals of this program. Look, I'm not trying to get the Nobel Peace Prize for this show. However, I do believe that if campaigns and the way the candidates talk and message the public is scrutinized more honestly by people on their own side and people from the other side, it doesn't matter, but honestly scrutinized, and evaluated. We might start seeing better people once they get into office, because now the campaign never ends. Even for president, there used to be a period after you got elected of about a year and a half where you would basically stop the campaign mode after you got elected. That doesn't exist anymore. These political consultants who are, like I said, are bad at what they do now are in the White House full time, continuing to give that terrible, terrible advice. You just need to look at what President Biden's been doing the last few weeks to understand what I'm talking about. It never ends. And we need to have a better country. We want a better country. We actually need better candidates and better campaigns. And that's why I'm doing this. I'd like to bring in, again, we call the show the Analysts because it's not just going to be me. We're always going to have other guests. And I'd like to bring in someone who is a good, smart, young GOP strategist. And we're going to have Democrat strategists on this show too. Democrats, don't worry, it's going to be plenty of that. They just have to be honest and be willing to critique both sides and praise both sides. So before we get to Krisha, I just want to tell you a little bit about some of the people that we'll be talking to in this particular program. Now, we're going to be talking to a little bit later also a candidate for Congress, one of those candidates, again, that has, I think, at this point, some pretty good messaging, but I'm going to challenge him on some of it. And we're going to talk about it. His name is Berney Flowers. He's running for Congress in Maryland in a traditionally blue Democratic Party stronghold. He's running as a Republican, but I think he has a really interesting personal message. We'll be talking to him. And then later in the show, one of the things we're going to do in every one of these shows is look at history. You got to learn from history in this country. And I think that there's a presidential election not that long ago that is very similar to this one. And I'll be talking to someone who's an expert on PR and also basically an armchair, but I think better than some of the academics out there in history to talk about it. But without any further ado, let's bring in someone who I think is really an impressive person. Her name is Krisha Lenza, and she is a GOP strategist. I've appeared on some shows with her, particularly on Newsmax every once in a while. And I think she's a great person to talk to about, listen, the big story, the elephant in the room. We're in the middle of a presidential election, folks, the 2024 election. And there's been very interesting things that have been happening in recent weeks and days that I'd really like to talk to her about. So if she's with us right now, make sure that she's joined us. Krisha Lenza, are you with us? And thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Again, GOP strategist Krisha Lenza, who has a much nicer background than mine in every way, and she's nicer to look at too. Krisha, before I go into some of the individual aspects, I've been talking, as we were waiting for you to join, I was talking about how we have a very unique presidential election here right now, in that you have one candidate who's on trial, who is very much constricted in where he can go on any given day. But we have another in Joe Biden, who presumably could go anywhere he wants any day, campaign everywhere he wants, but is that really what they want? So I just want your overall kind of general assessment of where we are right now.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head with respect to the movement on both campaigns. Trump is essentially being held hostage in court as a result of the legal, quote unquote, legal lawfare that we're seeing. And Joe Biden has free reign. It's truly the split screen campaign trail, because it could not be more divergent. And Joe Biden may have the ability to go wherever he wants, but he is not going to the places where people truly need to hear him, such as the campuses that are now experiencing riots as a result of his lack of leadership. He's not going to the crime-ridden areas and the bodegas, such as we saw Donald Trump go a few weeks back. So yes, I think it could not be more different, but it's really an example of the policies that both candidates put forward with their overall messaging.
Yeah, now I'm about to say something very humble but true. I think one of the dumbest things anyone can say is the following sentence. If I were advising Donald Trump, ... because I don't really think he takes general advice from folks. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's not a good thing. But whenever I start a sentence like that, I always try to call time out and say, I know I'm not in a position to tell Donald Trump what to do and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm trying to be humble here. However, in general, when the trial began and it was clear that Donald Trump wasn't going to be able to leave New York City on any day of the trial, even though, by the way, it's the other way around. You have a right as a defendant to be in the courthouse. It's up to the judge whether he or she makes you stay in the courthouse. Very controversial that the judge has made Donald Trump be in the case. But again, be that as it may, again, I really feel like, again, not to be critical of Donald Trump, I think overall, because I think you're right. I think he's taken some advantage of this. But the way I see it, when he walks out of the courtroom every day, we've seen the video of him walking out of the courtroom every day. We know what those little metal doors look like by now. He has typically, I think, spent, again, my opinion, he spent too much time talking about the case and not enough time taking advantage of this free publicity he's getting. Joe Biden can't get, the bodies into the seats at any of his rallies or anything else like that. Donald Trump's got the whole world watching, and sometimes he talks about the campaign issues and sometimes he doesn't. I wonder if you agree with me. Do you think that he should let especially since he's under this gag order, don't talk about the trial, just talk to the American people about crime or inflation or something like that?
I would agree. I think it's very important for him to stay on message, but to be fair, I might disagree a little bit
No,
in
that's
that
okay.
I think he has actually, Jake. I think in terms of the taking advantage of New York and what New York has to offer, his campaign and his advisors have been pretty smart. The bodega visit was brilliant in my view, as well as last week with the union workers. Yes, the union bosses, the UAW, Sean Fain may be against Donald Trump, and he might have difficulty in states like Michigan rallying people behind him because they're so progressive. But the actual people within the union understand that Donald Trump is the only one who is going to represent their interests. So I think he's been pretty on message. And even if he does talk about the case, despite the gag order, it just shows again to the American public how tired they are of Joe Biden using his DOJ and his corrupt intelligence bureaucracy to go after Donald Trump. And people recognize that instead of prosecuting criminals on the streets in Manhattan and throughout New York, Alvin Bragg, Letitia James are focused on cases that have less than zero merit in criminal court right now.
Okay, so let's say that for now you're giving him an A on the opportunities taken. I'm going to give him a B plus. Okay. But here's something that I think that we can both agree could get him to an A plus. So you mentioned the visiting to the bodega. For those of you who don't know some of the details, this was a bodega where the owner there was being robbed. His life was threatened. He went and defended himself. And the DA of Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, literally tried to prosecute the owner of the bodega for defending himself. Of course, eventually the case was dropped, thankfully, because it got a lot of publicity. But going there was a way not only to show support for this guy, but to show the disdain and anger that people have and people who may vote for Donald Trump have for the destruction of the justice system in our major cities. But to get him to, and I think going to with the union workers, that was another one. I think that there's a lot of other places that Donald Trump can go, even being constricted to New York City. So one of the places I think, and you can tell me what you think, I think you should go to the migrant encampment at Floyd Bennett Field, which holds a special place in my heart because I moved to New York around high school time and lived in the Rockaways, and it's a beautiful spot geologically. It is, the beaches are incredible. The location is great. It's warmer in the winter, cooler in the summer. It's a fantastic place, and it's been destroyed by one city administration after the next. There are dozens of high-rise public housing projects, which are death traps for everyone. They're trying to phase them out. They've done a lot of horrible things there, and now they're sending all the migrants there. I think he should go there. I think that he should, you're right, he should go to these campuses. Again, even if it's just across the street. Very touching that Speaker Mike Johnson went there. By the way, great political messaging and imagery for him. Donald Trump has the opportunity to do so. So I wonder if you have, first of all, weigh in on that and whether you think there's some other places that he may want to visit. I throw in maybe even the floor of the New York Stock Exchange too, especially with all these fears about inflation and what they're doing to stocks.
I think all three of those locations would be very important. And they're also potentially saying that Trump might go to the Bronx, Yankee Stadium, Madison Square Garden, and just to show that juxtaposition, as you mentioned, between the crowd that Joe Biden draws and the people who Trump is able to gather. I mean, the bodega trip was very impromptu. You saw people from very diverse backgrounds cheer for Trump, and to show different types of people supporting his campaign is really necessary right now, especially as the Democrats are honing in on the critical women vote, which we know is basically their play on trying to cater to, radical policies with respect to abortion, and also just really pandering again to that fringe part of their own party.
Okay, so let's talk about Joe Biden right now. And, we've already referred to it. I don't think that, listen, I've been watching Joe Biden as a politician for more than 40 years. The first thing I want to say is I don't care if you love Joe Biden or hate Joe Biden. The deterioration in his energy is way down. I always thought that he was really big on bluster, and if I were his consultant, I would have said, talk a little slower, don't boast about stuff that isn't true. But you do have a good inflection in his voice. I mean, he did have a good, clear speaking voice. He was a faster talker. This whole myth about how he has a lifelong stutter is, I don't believe it's true. And if it is true, it certainly has come back, which I don't know if happened. So that's one thing. I'll give him, but I also give him some credit now as president in the last few appearances he made. Now, on paper, I think they were smart places for him to go. Like he went to Scranton, which is, his hometown. And Scranton is one of those places that's in a swing state. It's a swing area. The suburbs of Scranton certainly could swing the election. If I were writing his schedule out, I would definitely tell him to go there. Whether or not he executed the visit well or not is another story. I think that there was an event where there was no one lined up to actually go and see him. So, you got to be careful about that. One of the best movies about campaigning that you'll ever see is the movie The Candidate with Robert Redford.
Yes.
For those of you who haven't seen it, you should see it. And there's a great montage where they're, it's a statewide campaign in California, which even now with today's technology is a bear. But in 1973 or 4, when they were making that movie, you can imagine. And they're traveling all over these places. And there's some of these places where Robert Redford shows up. They're making a real priority showing up. And there's 3 people in the audience. And, you can just see the frustration and the set. I mean, that takes the air out of you when you're working on a campaign or when you're a candidate. But, we're going to roll some video or, either, we'll do it now. We'll show there's a couple of things I want to talk about imagery here before I talk about the way he sounds and things like that. When Joe Biden appears in public outdoors, they always throw these sunglasses on him.
Right, the Ray-Bans.
The Ray-Ban sunglasses. And my feeling about that is that, he's had some work on his face. He clearly needs glasses. When he gives speeches and he's squinting at the prompter, these political consultants who I've trashed to hell already in the show a number of times, it's clear that the rule for both Republican and Democrat political consultants that they believe is true is that you should never wear glasses in public if you're a candidate. It makes you look old. I think it makes him look old to be squinting like this and to be wearing sunglasses like that. He reminds me of what you do with these elderly people after they have the cataract surgery and they're wearing the big sunglasses. So, I mean, just from an imaging point of view, he's not a terrible looking guy, especially for his age. Why do they do this? I mean, have you seen this kind of stuff where they worry? I mean, everyone wants to look nice, but I think it's making him look like a buffoon.
I agree because I'm against Joe Biden, but I think his overall supporters would say that it makes him look cool. He's trying to relate to the next generation. I think they would view him as hip and trying to, even his colloquialisms that he uses, you could tell that he's really, really trying his hardest. For me, it seems very inauthentic, but for his supporters, I think they'd probably view it as a win.
All right. Well, let's talk about, now, I mean, I'm trying to be nice. I was trying to talk about his appearance and how, and you made the point, like some people might like it. So it's not a complete fail. It's not an F- to throw those on, even though I don't love it. But what we can't get around is the sound. And I know, and we're working on this technically. Let's take a look at 2 of the sound bites from Joe Biden from the past week that I think are really damaging for him, in addition to what they look like, but also what they sound like. The first one is Joe Biden appearing at an Earth Day event with among other people, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and he's supposedly answering a question about all the anti-Semitism on campus, which you mentioned. I don't know if we can roll that soundbite now.
Condemn the anti-Semitic protests on college campuses.
I condemn the anti-Semitic protests. That's why I've set up a program to deal with that. I also condemn those who don't understand what's going on with the Palestinians and how they're being.
Should the Columbia University president resign?
Right this way. I didn't know that. I'll have to find out more about it.
All right, so you heard that there. First of all, a lot of it unintelligible. He says something like, I also condemn the people who don't know what the Palestinians and blah, 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 blah. And then he said, so, I mean, that's a bad one. Now, the second one was the one that got even more traction. This is the soundbite of Joe Biden clearly reading the stage direction on his teleprompter. Let's listen to that. This is the one where he says the word pause.
Imagine what we can do next. 4 more years. Pause. 4 more years. Pause. 4 more years.
4 more years. I talk about political consultants and I talk about staffers. Joe Biden has done this a number of times now, where he's literally read the stage direction. I assume that on the prompter, they probably have it in double parentheses, where he's supposed to see that that's a stage direction. They have a choice. They can either take that out of the teleprompter and risk, which I don't think is a big risk, having him talk over the staged chanting, or they can have an embarrassing moment like this. What would you do in these situations? I know I'm giving you the Kobayashi Maru for your Star Trek fans. That's kind of the no-win situation. But Christian, what would you do in this situation?
Because Joe Biden commits egregious blunders every step of the way, leaving anything to chance, even with a teleprompter, I would remove the pause and just let him speak and over the chanting. But again, both of those examples are incredibly scary because it shows his decline and the difference between Donald Trump's stamina after sitting in court all day and then still campaigning with a lot of vigor versus Joe Biden, who is incredibly unintelligible, whether he's talking about supporting the Hamas protesters and then deferring to AOC, who's incredibly radical. And then with respect to this pause incident, I mean, it just shows he needs a pause. He needs to take a break from the campaign trail. He needs to take a break from being president because he is incapable.
I'm all about outside the box thinking here. So putting aside Joe Biden and his issues with the teleprompter, I really want every political consultant and every person working for someone in office right now to understand this one thing. And by the way, I feel the same way about television news anchors. Repeat after me. Stop using the teleprompter. The teleprompter is something that gets you in trouble. In the Republican response to the State of the Union several weeks ago, it was clear that the young congresswoman who was giving the State of the Union, the response, was tripped up by that teleprompter. The teleprompter also, even if you're good at it, I've been a long believer in believing that it actually makes you stupid. The more that you don't allow your own words to come out of your mouth, the more you start to lose your intellectual edge. Now, the argument against that is like, well, people are waiting to hear for a president or a candidate. He's got to give a really long speech. He or she has to give a really long speech, and they can't keep looking down at their notes and things like that. Hey, guess what? Don't have such a long speech. Speak for 2 or 3 minutes and then open up dialogue. Actually interact with the voters. Would you think that that would actually work for most candidates?
You'd think it would work for most candidates. It does not work for our president. I agree with you about the teleprompter. Even Roger Ailes, whether you like him or not, ultimately told people to be their most authentic self when they were on television. And even stumbling and not being exactly perfect in your teleprompter read actually endears people to that individual. So yes, Joe Biden stumbled, but it's just so clear with the pause that he does not fully understand what he is reading. And it just is a major, major problem for people who are watching, because who knows, when he's making decisions, people are inferring that he doesn't understand what's going on in the Oval Office. So I would agree that presidents, anyone on the campaign trail, they need to keep it short. But that being said, Donald Trump holds rallies for hours on end, talking about every single issue, being incredibly funny. For many would consider him very funny and witty, interacting with the crowd. So it just shows a difference between a potential candidate who really understands what people want to hear, the major issues, and another, the president basically, who just is totally out of touch.
The last topic I'd bring up with you is, obviously on paper, Donald Trump is running against Joe Biden. But one of the things that I think is true, especially when you're running against an incumbent president, is you're also running against what's going on in the country. In other words, you're basically saying the overall country isn't working. And I'm going to be talking a little bit later about the 1980 presidential election. And do you know that Ronald Reagan mentioned Jimmy Carter's name just once in his major national speeches once the general election started out? That was in the Republican National Convention. He mentioned his name just once. His entire campaign was, hey, America is not where we want it to be right now. We need to do better. I wonder if, that being said, while it's a great contrast that he can go on and on at these rallies, if you had a choice, and this I'm putting on the spot here, but if you had a choice between more of these rallies, which are historic, I mean, that's when I knew Donald Trump was going to win in 2016 after not thinking he was going to win the first few months. When I saw people showing up during the primary season in big numbers at freaking rallies at a primary, I was, oh my God, this guy's going to win. But if you had a choice between more of those massive rallies where he shows how much more vigorous he is than Joe Biden and goes on for an hour, or more visits to places like the bodega, more places, more visits, like when he went to Detroit in the late days of the 2016 campaign, which, by the way, I think that clinched the election for him. Which one would you choose? Now, you can't say both. What would you say? Go do more bodega visits or more rallies?
If I can't say both, I would say more bodega visits, because unlike Joe Biden, Donald Trump is able to get to all of these locations. Joe Biden did not show up to East Palestine until over a year later. Donald Trump does show up, and that's a huge advantage. And it really means a lot to the people in those communities, because they're understanding that he is taking the time. He doesn't have all the time in the world to campaign because he's tied up in court, but it's meaningful. When he does have time to be on the campaign trail, he's making a concerted effort to let those people know that they're important.
Well, folks, I told you we were going to have smart analysts on this show, and Krisha, I think she gave the right answer. That's my biased opinion. Again, I'm not ever going to claim on this show that I'm not biased or partisan, but I'm certainly going to let you know that I'll admit it every single time. My biased opinion is yes. All candidates, not just Donald Trump, should start going out and actually publicly campaigning. There was a great candidate who did that many, many years ago, a man named Jack Kemp, who was, as many of you might remember, Bob Dole's running mate, but more importantly, was a fantastic congressman in New York State for a long time. And he was never afraid, maybe because he was an NFL star and he had that experience, but he was never afraid to go to the major urban areas of this country. He's the reason, by the way, that a lot of parts of Harlem and other major cities in this country have at least some economic investment. So he showed up. Show up. It's the old joke about dating. 60% of it is just showing up. I think that 70% of being a candidate is just showing up. Krisha, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your expertise. Can't wait to speak to you again soon.
Oh, pleasure being here, and thanks for having me.
Okay, coming up next, we're going to be speaking to a very special guest, an actual candidate. This isn't just a pretend show where we just sort of sit on the sidelines in our pajamas and criticize people. We're going to be talking to Lieutenant Colonel Berney Flowers, who is running for the House seat in the 3rd District, 3rd Congressional District in Maryland. Please stick with us for that. It's really going to be an interesting conversation. We don't just talk about candidates and talk about campaigns. We actually talk to candidates. That's one of the things that we want to do. And we have a really interesting candidate, I believe, as my first candidate guest for this first program. His name is Colonel Berney Flowers. He's a United States Air Force veteran, and we'll hear a little bit more about his personal bio in just a second. But just so you know right now, he is running as a Republican candidate in a traditionally Democrat or blue district, the 3rd Congressional District in Maryland, for that House seat. And so, but I think he's got a more interesting story than just the fact that he's a veteran. That those are always interesting backstories, I think, when veterans run for Congress. So let's, without any further ado, bring in Colonel Flowers. And Colonel Flowers, before I ask you about the situation, and what you're looking at from an election point of view and campaigning, just tell us a little bit about your bio. I mean, and where you're coming from as just an American, let alone a candidate.
Jake, thanks for giving me the opportunity. I'm America first, but that just means I'm America first. I'm not tied into with anyone or anything like that. I'm a Southern boy, and I joined the United States Air Force in 1987, got commissioned, and spent 21 years in the United States Air Force doing things for Uncle Sam and for the American people. After that, spent a little time at USAA, where I met Todd. And after that, I went to work as a civilian, a government civilian. I was a plank owner, am a plank owner at US Cybercom, which means that I helped build a place and started it up back in 2009. After that, I got a call from US Northcom, and they wanted me to be their liaison for the 4-star general out of Northcom and US Northcom, Northcom and NORAD and US Northcom. So I know that sounds confusing, but it's one command with two names. And so I stayed there for a very, very, very long time. I was their liaison to Fort Meade. So any business that Northcom, NORAD had with Fort Meade, I was involved, and I served as the 4 Stars representative. So I got to see a lot of stuff. After that, when COVID happened, NORAD and U.S. Northcom decided that they needed somebody like me over at DHS, and that's when the fight started. I was their liaison to Secretary Mayorkas, on his senior staff as a senior advisor, and I saw a lot of money being wasted. Saw a lot of things being done that I thought were literally un-American, and I was helping to do those things. And so I decided that I was going to retire. I had enough time to retire again, and now you hear me running for Congress.
So tell me about your situation. You're still in the primary stage, correct?
Sure.
And tell me like how that's going and where where you've gone so far with that.
Well, I was the very first candidate to put my name in to run against the incumbent, John Sarbanes. He was an 18-year incumbent, and I felt that I could take him down. I know that sounds like a tall order, but I've never been scared. So I'm minding my business, working with my team. Back in October, I get a strange phone call from my team, and they're all happy because John Sarbanes has dropped out of the race, which is very unusual for an 18-year incumbent. And more importantly, his father had been in that seat and eventually became a senator. So that's a huge deal. So I did that. And in the meantime, since then, we've got 31 candidates that have jumped into the race. I think there's 6 Republicans, 7 including me, and the rest are Democrats. One candidate has raised over $3 million. However, all of that money pretty much has come from out-of-state donors, and we'll deal with him later. And another candidate has raised, I believe, $500,000, another 100,000. I am the leading Republican, according to Maryland Matters newspaper, and I've raised about $25,000. Most of that's on my own money. I've written about $10,000 in checks, but we're going to beat him with shoe leather. We're going to get out. I'm out every night doing interviews and talking to people and making it happen. I'm going out this afternoon, putting up signs. If you drive around this area and Anne Arundel County or Carroll County or Howard County, you're bound to see one of my signs on one of the main thoroughfares. So we're going to outwork them, and then we're going to beat them.
You know, I can't look at candidates and campaigns without trying to strategize myself. Just like anyone watching a football game looks at the team and thinks, everyone knows they're the armchair quarterback. I would have thrown the ball here. I would have run it. Or if in baseball, here's where I would have hit and run. This is what I do. I do that in sports too, but I do it with politics as well. And when I look at your campaign website, there's a lot of stuff that if I were running your campaign, I would have done too. I think, for example, we know you're in a traditionally blue district.
Right.
So putting your Republican Party affiliation and all that kind of stuff out front, it wouldn't be smart, I think, and you're not doing that. If you were outside of Maryland and the government world, or that, the kind of people who live in Maryland, I would have downplayed your military experience a little bit more. But Maryland and Northern Virginia are just filled with so many ex-military. I think that you have to do that, and you've done that. But the most important thing, and this is really what I think is the most important message that people can learn from your campaign, and I think that I know that you get this, but let's explain it to the viewers. It's important in any election, but especially with the way people feel so very tribal right now about their parties and things like that, to appeal to a message that goes beyond that. And I think that one of the things that comes through, even though you may not say these exact words on your website and in your messaging, is it doesn't matter. You don't vote for me because I'm a Republican or because you're a Democrat. Vote for me because I'm the candidate who's in favor of a common sense message. This isn't about any kind of partisanship. We've left so much common sense off the table, whether it's trans people in a bathroom, whether it's allowing for an open border as an official policy, which again, maybe you really want to take in all these refugees, but at the very least, do it in an orderly fashion. So, I mean, my point is, how do you get across saying more than just what I just said? Common sense. But I mean, what are some of the things that you've been able to hit on based on that messaging?
Well, on my palm card, I have the words "people before politics," and that's really kind of what I stand for. Again, I fought for this country. I defended this country in ways that most people will never see. I carried a top secret clearance for 34 years. And the bottom line is that, as you mentioned, everything was cool when I was working over at Fort Meade. But when I got over to DHS and I saw literally millions of people brought into this country during COVID, and millions of them were unvetted. I'm unvaccinated and I got my own personal reasons for doing that, but the government was trying to force people to do things. And I don't believe in forcing Americans to do things. We have rights. If folks want to take the vaccine, that's a wonderful thing. But when you tell me I have to take it, then I'm going to have a problem, and I'm going to fight for those who want to be unvaccinated. I will tell you a story of one of the people I was working with. She was a 15-year Coast Guard NCO, and she was pregnant, and the government was forcing her to take the vaccine, and that's why I draw the line. And so she left. She gave up her career because we just didn't really know what was in it. It was too much of a risk to take, and I understand where she's coming from. And more importantly, you look at DHS while I was there, and most of the people on staff were working from home in our most trying times. So during that Afghan retrograde, as you remember, we brought 85,000 Afghans back home, and I was helping to do that at $119 million a day, unbudgeted, by the way. I was the guy helping to bring the money over from DOD to DHS to house and feed these people. I'm watching all this and I'm just thinking, why are we doing this? This isn't, yeah, some of those people would have been killed. I get it. But and we had an obligation to some of them, but some of them weren't vetted. We couldn't have vetted all those people at the same time. And as again, I was bringing up the idea of all those people coming over from across the border. They could have had diseases, they could have been terrorists, they could have been spies, all kinds of things. We could not have vetted 10 million people in that short amount of time. And we told the American people that those folks were being vetted. And I just have a problem with that. I can never lie to the American people. And same thing with Haiti. They've got chaos going on there right now. Well, in 2021, 18,000 people showed up under a bridge in Haiti. Under a bridge at the El Paso immigration station. And that had to be coordinated. So there seems to me a tie between the idea that the Biden administration wants to bring people into the United States at a record rate, and they're doing so in a way that I feel is uncomfortable and unsafe for the American population. And as an officer who took an oath in 1987 to defend this country, that oath is still valid, and that's what I'm about. But again, I've been called a Republican. A friend of mine called me a Republicrat, if that makes any sense. I'd never heard the term before, but I'm a bit of a centrist. I'm just trying to do what's best for the American people. And with my background, if I sat around and let all this stuff happen and not raise the alarm, not try to do anything about it, to me, that would be un-American.
Colonel Flowers, it's interesting, your last answer, and it brings up something, again, from a consulting, analytical point of view about the effectiveness of a campaign. You have a needle that you have to thread here. You're representing not only a congressional district, but a state that has a massive number of federal workers.
Yes.
So when you criticize something that the federal government is doing, however justified it is, you have now clearly you're making those criticisms from a point of view of actually being there. You're not an armchair quarterback. You actually were there. At the same time, you need to be able to say, look, it's the people in charge who have directed federal workers, like I was, and like many of you are, and many of you are married to or live, and so that there's something not working that great here. It's not about attacking you, but it's about understanding that we need better leadership and better guidance. Now, I want to get to a much touchier subject based on that, which is the word contrition. Political consultants, professional political consultants, are all convinced incorrectly that a candidate or a politician ever really saying they're sorry for something is a bad idea. I think that if it's done even 90% honestly, but certainly 100% honestly, I think it would be a huge attraction for me. I would really want to vote for someone who said, I made a mistake or I was involved in a mistake. Now, someone who is you're in the Gulf War and you were in some other things like that, is there a point where you can be someone who says, like, look, I'll never apologize for being there for my brothers in arms and sisters in arms. I'll never apologize for defending freedom. But boy, there was some bad mistakes here. I mean, we look at this today and it looks like Iran won that war. I mean, are you able to make that kind of a message without feeling, oh boy, they're going to say I'm like Donald Trump, saying that people are stupid if they were in the army or something like that? How do you thread that needle, Colonel?
Well, here's the way I look at it. My country needed me, and I will never ask questions if my country calls. And I believe that to be a sacred duty. And we fix the problem, and then we analyze it later, just like you're doing right now. But as we grow older, I'm 58 years old, and I sit back and watch and think about some of the things that I participated in. They weren't necessarily bad, but if we're doing them for the wrong reasons, that's not right. For example, the Iran. You wonder why they're so angry with us. Well, we deposed a democratically elected government, if I'm not mistaken, in 1952. The Shah of Iran, we put him in place. We did so because we wanted the oil, and not just us, but the national oil consortium. So the idea is these rich companies made a lot of money off of that, but we again deposed a democratically elected government, and that's not what we're supposed to be in the business of doing. And I don't believe in spending one drop of American blood to go out and make money for people. We've got our own oil. We've got the best technology in the world, and maybe we can cut back on a little bit of our largesse and try to make things a little bit better for other folks. The best thing we can do is not get into endless wars. And we've sent a lot of blood and treasure overseas for a lot of wrong reasons, and I intend to make that stop.
Yeah, I think that that's important. The the problem is that again we have an absolute moronic fifth grade
Yeah,
level political news media here. Both, and I think it's a right and left problem. I wish it were just the left wing, where it's all just it's got to be one thing or the next, which is why people like Donald Trump I think really threw a loop in things. I mean, here was someone who was clearly a patriot and clearly more a supporter of the military, but someone who was very critical of the Gulf War. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. But if you're a fifth grader or you have the mind of a fifth grader, then you have a hard time with that. And I think that
yeah,
you just mentioned it. You are not a conspiracy theorist. Everyone knows it's completely documented fact that we deposed the democratically elected person in Iran at the time. That doesn't excuse the mullahs of Iran for being the leading terrorists in the world. It doesn't
right.
excuse Iran for killing 500 or 600 of our troops during the Gulf War in Iraq. But we should realize that we have to have better policies. I think that,
Agree.
and we have. There's been times when we've learned the lesson and times when we haven't. So it isn't all negative. What do you think about now again, it's the economy stupid. I don't know. I don't think it's the issue that it once was as far as the overriding issue, but we have something now called inflation.
Oh yeah.
And you represent an area, one of the things that I was a financial journalist for many, many years. And one of the things I used to tell people is that you have to understand that while federal workers and government workers don't make a lot of money, they do have incredible job security compared to the rest of the country. And that is worth something that's hard to calculate, but actually some PhD folks have calculated that. So if you were going to go around and say, oh, the economy is terrible to a bunch of people who are in much more better positions as far as their jobs, you would fail. But I think you have a better message to go with if you have. And I want to ask you, how have you addressed inflation? Because inflation is one of those things that you can have a job and you can be really wealthy and it hurts you. So are you making inflation a big part of your messaging? And if so, how?
I am. I mean, think about going to a grocery store. You're paying $8 for a pack of bacon. And if you want that premium, whole food stuff, you're talking 10. I don't care who you are, it's going to affect you. Second, my mortgage rate in the house that I'm sitting in right now is 2.25. A young couple, 30 years old, they just got together. They're looking at 8% and upwards to buy a home. And then they're going to have to put 20% down. That is unacceptable on a $500,000 house. And if you're trying to live here in Howard County or Carroll County or Anne Arundel County, that is tough. And you got to remember also, there are a lot of federal workers here. We're very, very close to Fort Meade and the federal infrastructure. And even they are having trouble buying new houses. And at some point, there has to be a reckoning. We got to do better. And things don't have to be this expensive. And our federal government, our Fed seems to be driving inflation up. and driving up affordability up, especially for those young people. We're not going to be, at the top of the food chain all the time. At some point, we're going to go into retirement and they're going to be in charge, and they're not going to be able to afford the lifestyles that we have right now. And also, look at Social Security. We've all paid into it, and now they're talking about changing the rules at the last minute. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's fair. And our government has the ability to do things about that rather than send money into foreign wars, endless wars, and things that I don't believe in.
Last question. Look, this is the way things go. We only have about 30 seconds, but honestly, you know what's going to happen. Hopefully, you win the primary. They're just going to come at you and say you're a Donald Trump stooge, that no Republican is running. It isn't like his cult member or something like that. How are you prepared to respond to that? Because you're going to get it, and I'm sure you've already heard it.
Oh, I've heard a lot of that, but the bottom line is that I'm just going to put myself out there. I mean, you see this flag behind me, and I have given my whole life to defending this country. And, the fact that our current government has given away what I would guess $200 billion to Ukraine. We just signed another $90 billion bill to send money to Gaza and also to Taiwan, where there's actually no war. But we've got 6 aircraft carrier and battle groups off the coast of Taiwan right now. So the issue of the day is we seem to be interested in making war on people, and we need to back that down. There should always be an opportunity for diplomacy. And I don't know why, back when I was a kid, the Republicans were the war hawks and the Democrats were the peace people. Now that's totally reversed, but there's a lot of money involved in that. And I think that money should be spent right here in the USA.
Yeah, and you talked about diplomacy. There was a Republican diplomat, love him or hate him, Henry Kissinger, who at least tried. I mean, I don't even see anyone trying to pretend to be like that right now and doing the shuttle diplomacy, nothing like that. And again, I think that's a common sense message. All right, well, listen, my advice is worth the price you're paying for it, which is zero. But I'd say, I mean, honestly, I think common sense and inflation are your 2 best platforms to push from the primary on, and just tell people really quickly when the primary is and how to find out more about you.
14 May is when the primary happens. We expect to win as a leading Republican. You can find my website, flowersformaryland.com. Again, flowersformaryland.com. For those of you that are what we call 4x4s, the staunch Republicans, we're about to send out a message that a little commercial that'll come to your phone. So don't delete it. Look at it. I think you're going to like what you see. And if you check out my website, you'll see all that stuff. I wrote a book called Black Values Matter with the idea of having a plan to fix Baltimore. And again, why are we sending money overseas when our inner city is falling apart? These are American taxpayers and they deserve better. But here in Howard County, here in Carroll County and District 3 and Anne Arundel County, bottom line is things are well, but they have to be maintained in order to stay that way. And I see some things on the horizon that I know how to fix. So that's what it's all about.
Colonel Flowers, so much. First of all, thanks for your service and thanks for spending the time here today. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about how there was an election not that long ago that can teach us something about this year's presidential election. I hope you'll stick around for that.
I will. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Take care, Jake.
Thank you.
What does it mean to be a leader?
It's taking my first solo flight.
At the University of North Dakota, we lead our own way.
To the Analysts, I'm Jake Novak. And one of the things that I really, really stress when people are learning about political campaigns or just following politics is please don't come to the table without some historical knowledge. One of the biggest things that I used to get rid of in TV news scripts when I was an executive producer was when I saw words like unprecedented or phrases like the first time in history. Because 9 times out of 10, if you looked at it, it wasn't the first time in history, and it wasn't unprecedented. And it's one of those things that people need to learn not to make it. Listen, we want to make things more dramatic in television. I understand that, but you shouldn't lie or make up stuff about stuff like things like that. But that said, that means that there are examples in history that can teach us about things that are going on right now, especially when there are a lot of similarities. And I can't help thinking about the 1980 election lately, because there are so many similarities and so many lessons to learn from the 1980 election that can really help people understand, and if I were working on a campaign, understand how to execute a campaign better. Now, full disclosure, I'm not an idiot. I have a calculator. I understand that 1980 was 44 years ago. This would be like me talking about the election of 1936 in 1980 and telling everyone that that has a lot to teach us, and it didn't in that case. But that said, the country, of course, is much different. At the same time, some things aren't different. We're still doing a lot of campaigning in front of video cameras, whether they're from a phone or from an old school television. And one of the things that really, really stands out to me is that we are dealing in an inflationary period. There's no denying that. In fact, we got another report this morning that inflation is actually going up again, not just sticky, it's going up again. And also, we're in this very unique period where, if the polls are to be believed, we could see two incumbent presidents lose the election in a row. Again, that's what had happened in 1980. We had Gerald Ford, who lost as an incumbent in 1976, and then we had Jimmy Carter as an incumbent losing in 1980. Could we see Donald Trump be a loser in 2020, and then Joe Biden be a loser in 2024? There are a lot of things to talk about here. I want to bring on a special guest here. He's a longtime producer from Fox and Bloomberg News. He put on shows there, but he's now an award-winning communications professional. He works as a media trainer for CEOs and C-suite executives. And by the way, he happens to be a pretty big expert about American history and politics. I know he doesn't have the PhD, but he probably knows a lot more than those. So my friend and fellow expert, Michael Kingsley, thank you so much for joining us.
Jake, thank you very much for having me on. I literally have on my commander-in-chief hat for you and your audience today, so I'm going to do my best.
Listen, imaging is really important. You know, the accoutrement that presidents wear is not something to overlook. You know, you have John F. Kennedy had really cool swag when he was president. He was the first president to have kind of like that leather jacket with the presidential seal on it. Ronald Reagan did that a little bit. Jimmy Carter, never. Jimmy Carter always just looked like he was tired. At one point, he was carrying his own luggage, which he thought would make him a man of the people. He kind of was, actually, but that didn't work. So presidential swag, the hats and things like that. And of course, Donald Trump is always, he's got to wear the hats because of the hair situation. So,
right.
It's actually not a small thing. But I was just talking about, some of the more of the details. I was just talking about, again, these unique similarities. What did I miss? Because I think there's some other things that are similar to 1980 that you know about.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd be remiss in not mentioning the famous picture of Richard Nixon walking along the beach in his wingtips. The image makers missing the boat there, trying to look casual, maybe a little bit like JFK or something like that. Well, the first thing I wanted to point out was, the 1968 election was an incumbent losing also. The incumbent party was losing there. So there was a lot of turnover in that period, just generally. And I was saying to you earlier, half joking, anytime there's an ironclad rule, I think, anytime there's a Kennedy challenging you, you're in big trouble. So, LBJ and Humphrey were challenged. There was a situation they were in that led to RFK, the first RFK, challenging them in 1968. And then, of course, Teddy Kennedy challenging Carter in 1980. And then now you've got RFK Jr. challenging Biden, all the incumbents facing those. Of course, those are all very different circumstances. But it does bring that up that, everybody wants to look at the polls to predict what's going on. It's very useful to look at these patterns that you're talking about throughout history. And we do see a lot of similarities to 1980. So the big one you talked about there is the economy. And it's really interesting. I went back and looked. The economy was actually pretty good through 1978. There was about 4% growth for the first 2 years. That was the best economy that there had been since the 60s, because it started to come back in 76. But there was high inflation. Sound familiar? And then in 79 and 80, the bottom basically fell out. It wasn't until 1980 that you actually had negative growth and had a recession, but the cake was pretty much baked in there. So even the most armchair pundit knows that the economy has a big impact. So that's the first one. Do you want me to go through a couple of others?
No, let's talk about that. So, the thing is that, look, obviously we can talk about the policies of the Biden administration that have contributed or not contributed to this economic situation. Absolutely. But still, if you're a campaign staffer, that's not something, you didn't have control over that.
Right.
So I wanted to talk a little bit, but yes, you have to find a way to message that properly. Now, inflation, you mentioned. The reason why inflation is so important is that when you think about it, it's actually the worst possible economic scenario for an incumbent. It's even worse than Great Depression level unemployment, because as bad as unemployment is, for example, the Great Depression unemployment rate was like 25%, which is
Right.
crazy high. But some people think it's higher. It was higher than that. No, it really was just 25%. That's terrible. But it still only affected that quarter of the country and their families, which is a lot. But still, inflation affects every single person. A lot of rich people are kind of cheap sometimes, let's be honest.
Right.
And even if they're not, they're noticing it. The American people now are spending more of their income on food than ever before. Now, some of that is because of the DoorDash apps and these kids who are getting avocado toast for breakfast. But still, that number doesn't spike if it isn't just someone getting milk and butter at a supermarket also going higher. How do you okay, you're a communications guy.
Yep.
And I'm giving you the out here and telling you I don't think there's any way around talking around inflation. But what would you advise Joe Biden right now to say about inflation? I'll give you my opinion after you, but I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah. When I'm doing media training now for corporate executives, I always tell them one of the most important things is to know your audience. They really need to know who they're talking to so that the messages can be tailored to that audience. Now, with politics, and particularly when the two candidates are ex-presidents or current president and a former president, the audience knows them also. So you can't tell them something isn't true if they know it and they've experienced it and they know it about them. But very important to be empathetic and to be listening to. Part of being a good speaker is being a good listener. And the election I want to bring up here is 1992. Everybody's familiar with, that's when George W. Bush was running for re-election against Bill Clinton. Not George W. Bush, excuse me, George H.W. Bush was running against Bill Clinton. And the famous debate clip, of course, is George H.W. Bush looking at his watch. That's the one everybody knows best. But there's also a clip from a town hall debate where a woman stands up in the audience and says to Bush and Clinton, "Tell me about how the deficit has affected you." And Bush goes first, and he says, "Well, I go out on the trail and I see people struggling to make ends meet, and that hurts me, and I know," has sort of a boilerplate answer. "Governor Clinton, what is your answer?" And I'm not going to do a Clinton impression, but Clinton looks at the woman and says, "Tell me again how the deficit's impacted you." That's the first thing he says. So he puts it right back there. He's being empathetic, letting her talk, buying himself some time to formulate his answer. And then she goes through and talks about how her friends have lost jobs and are struggling and so on. And then he talks about his policies in contrast with the president. So it's easier when you're the challenger to say everything's bad. Your question was, how should Biden talk about it? He should definitely not be doing the Bidenomics stuff that kind of failed over the past 6 weeks, something like that. Much more impactful to say that he knows, and it's not spinning it, right? You don't want to do that, but you don't want to talk about it for too long either. He should talk about how he's seeing people struggling with it and how his policies are doing better, are going to make an impact, whereas Donald Trump's policies, in his opinion, will make it worse. And then, Trump was president, so he can point out specific things in Trump's record, and he can point out things in his own record and do the best he can there.
Yeah, that's a lot of good advice. So what I would add to that is a couple of things. First off, you mentioned it. Stop saying there is no inflation. I mean, they seem to have stopped saying that, and they moved on from that. And obviously those sound bites are going to live forever, and the Republicans can play this on about them saying it isn't true. But as we learned from the whole COVID vaccine thing, you can get away with that. I mean, how many sound bites there were of Kamala Harris and other Democrats saying, "I'm not going to trust any vaccine," when they were, and then later they're pushing the vaccine and telling people you're going to get fired if you don't get it. Listen, they got away with that. So he can get away with that, but he's got to stop saying there's no inflation. And it does seem he has done that. But there's another thing that I think is really important here. And I talked about it with Colonel Flowers just before you. I am a huge believer in at least believable contrition. Mm-hmm. And the political consultants, I am sure, are telling Biden, no, tell him that it's not your fault. Tell him that people following your policies. And I think that if Joe Biden could somehow believably go in front of the camera and say, look, we were trying to get the country going after COVID, and we probably did overspend, and we probably did put too much money out there, and we probably didn't do some of the right things because we were very much under the gun about COVID. That was a mistake. I'm taking responsibility for it. I know that led to more inflation. And now we're going to really reverse that. I don't think that would change everything from overnight, but it would be a fantastic message compared to what we're seeing right now. And especially, we just don't see contrition from candidates anymore. Again, you don't want to be some idiot going around saying, I'm sorry for everything all the time. That,
Right.
you got to use it strategically.
Yeah.
But for him to admit a mistake that led to inflation, as bad as, that's going to get all the political consultants to have a heart attack because they think you should never, ever say you're sorry for anything, no matter how bad it is. They're wrong. They're wrong. It works. It works if it's done somewhat believably. And I think that there's a few other things like that. But I want to move on to that a little bit more, back to the 1980 election, and get a little bit more granular.
Can I interrupt for 1 second and just add on to that, Jake? Because I want to give a little media tip to your audience there, which is the advantage of that also is once they've done it, it immunizes them a little bit against that. Because if a journalist asks them the same thing and they've kind of already dealt with it and answered it, then the journalist looks like the jerk. So you'll see that in interviews where the journalist will ask the question once, maybe twice. If they persist, the journalist looks really bad. So you can broaden that out a little bit and you can say, look, I've said some of my policies. I don't know if I would advise it in these words, but, I've addressed that and said that we're tweaking it and so on. I talked about that last month. And then you move on to another topic. And if the journalist persisted, but isn't everything really bad? Isn't it? I think I've addressed that, and then the journalist.
Oh, man. This isn't politics, but this is reminding me of the Hugh Grant going on Jay Leno and apologizing 75 times for the Divine Brown thing. And I think he said, I'm sorry, like 17 times. But you're right. After that, he never had to do it again. And anybody trying to ask him again not only looked like they were a jerk for pushing him on it, but looked like they were trying to steal Jay Leno's thunder, which is another thing. But I want to get a little bit more granular. I've talked about the personal appearances. Donald Trump is stuck in New York. He's done a couple. I mean, I think I'm giving him a B+. I know Krishna kind of gave him an A. I think it was good for him to go to the bodega. It was good for him to meet with those union people. I think he's making a mistake talking about the case. There's plenty of people talking about the case. Every time he's in front of that camera, he should take advantage of it by talking of the election and pretending it's an election appearance. But I also think he should show up to more places. I think he should go to the migrant encampment at Floyd Bennett Field. I think he should go to the sporting, whatever, stuff like that. Right. In 1980, Ronald Reagan made a very famous, we have a video of it. Ronald Reagan made a very famous visit on foot to the South Bronx. And the South Bronx isn't paradise now, but it really was bombed out, scary, much scarier back in 1980. Now, one of the reasons why he did it is because Jimmy Carter actually did the same thing in 1976, talking about losing 2 incumbents in a row. Why not?
I've been to that block. I've been to that specific block, Jake. Yeah.
Right. So, there's an opportunity now for Donald Trump, but also maybe Joe Biden can find a place that they can create a narrative that was maybe not so. Maybe he can go to some place. He can go to John McCain's tomb or something. I don't know, somewhere where there'll be a visible place. I think you should go where there's actually living people, however. And I mean, where do you think? Again, you've got you know the New York map as well as I do. Where would you send Donald Trump? And would you send Joe Biden to a place somewhere in New York while this is going on?
But it's funny, I hadn't considered that. I mean, honestly, I think right now, all the headlines, I turned off the TV for this, but it was all Columbia right now, the protests in Columbia. We're recording this on April 30th on Tuesday. And I would tell him, go right there. I mean, I think that's a message. The out party, the challenging candidate, really always wants to hammer any kind of disorder that's going on. You saw this in 2020 with the George Floyd protests and riots that were going on. Biden's big argument in 2020 is, I'm going to bring stability. I'm going to bring normalcy back. And Trump, now the within an airplane, the foot's on the other hand now. Yeah, I mean, I would tell him to go to Columbia and point right at the chaos and say, this is what's going on. So that's kind of a big jump. Manufacturing other things that are smaller I could think about. Now, where would I send Biden into in New York right now? I don't know. I think the appearance that Biden did on Howard Stern was actually pretty good for him. I think that was a good venue for him. Friendly media, knowing your audience. The audience for Howard Stern is right now, you might not know this if you haven't listened to Howard Stern in a long time, but is very affluent, very liberal. It's a subscription-based thing on Sirius and so on. And really the entire interview was Joe Biden telling folksy stories and Howard Stern just egging him on for that. that's great for him. That's something like connecting and being empathetic. So something along those lines. Listen, you can say what you will about the fundraiser, the Radio City fundraiser. That's playing to his audience also, but that puts him right in front of the cameras. There were a lot of protesters there too. So maybe my advice to Biden would be to stay away from New York, actually.
All right, last quick topic. Look, I talked about a lot of similarities, but there's something that you would think would be similar to the 1980 election. It isn't. I mean, we're going to roll this video. This is Ronald Reagan standing in front of the Statue of Liberty in September of 1980. Back then, the official national campaigns didn't start until after the conventions. It's one of those things. It was a conceit, but it was one of those things. So he's already the nominee. He's not officially starting to run against just Jimmy Carter in the campaign's mind, or the way that they used to frame it back then, until around Labor Day. And he makes a launch speech in front in the harbor across from the Statue of Liberty. And we talk about imaging here. And, people talking so much about how Joe Biden just looks so old and looks so frail, and the way he's walking. There's no denying that. Donald Trump certainly looks more vigorous and young and stronger than Joe Biden, but still he looks really old. Look at this video right now. This is Ronald Reagan, almost 70 years old, and he's wearing a shirt with almost all the buttons open. I mean, he looks like he's in the best shape there are candidates now running for office. There are athletes right now who don't look this good. Yeah. And it's one of those things where, honestly, the image consultants we talk about, I've been talking about political consultants and their messaging and where they should go, but boy, is there a job you would least like to have than being the person who has to make physically look good Joe Biden and Donald Trump right now? And you look at somebody like Reagan who had it all going for him.
Yeah, it's funny to think about Biden's image and ask what you would do with it. And to your point about contrition, I think I was thinking about Karine Jean-Pierre, who is the White House press secretary, and she was asked, I don't know, sometime the past 6 months. And her response was that she can't keep up with Biden. He's so vigorous and so on. And that's where the contrition would do well. I mean, if she said, look, Joe Biden is an older man, absolutely. But if I didn't think he could do the job, I wouldn't be here right now. He's got the best people around him. He's perfectly capable. You just saw him, pick an example, at the State of the Union or so on. But when you try and tell people something they manifestly know is not true, everybody knows that she's not having trouble keeping up with Joe Biden. A little bit of contrition, as you said, can go a long way in doing that. Reagan is a little bit of a unique case also, because he had his image made over 40 years of being in the public eye. That's an advantage that Donald Trump has too. I mean, he's still, I don't want to say coasting, but he's still got that impression in the back of people's heads as a TV guy on The Apprentice. That's how a lot of people came to know him.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael Kinsley. Again, a longtime producer at Fox News and Bloomberg News, but now an expert in communications, someone who advises CEOs and C-suite executives. I hope that you saw just in this segment the kind of good advice you can get. We were talking about politics, but we talked about messaging and a lot of other things. So hopefully people will get something out of that. And for those of you who want to do a little bit more reading up on the 1980 election, a little bit of stuff like that, you can never go wrong reading the books about Ronald Reagan by Lou Cannon, a Sacramento Bee reporter who became his biographer, was not really a Reagan fan, but in the spirit of the show, The Analysts, was able to grade him on his campaigning and on his policies, and ended up writing books that made him look really good just because he was dispassionately writing about him. I highly recommend the book. I think you can only get it on Kindle right now. It's called Governor Reagan. You want to understand why Ronald Reagan became president and what he did as president. He was actually much more of a hard worker and much more of a hands-on governor of California than he was president of the United States, if you can believe it. I highly recommend that book, Governor Reagan by Lou Cannon. Michael Kingsley, thanks for joining me. And thanks everyone for joining us on this first edition of The Analysts. Again, you heard it wasn't just me talking. We were talking to other people. Hopefully you've enjoyed this adult level, college level, maybe even graduate school level analysis of campaigning and messaging, because what you're getting everywhere else is fifth grade level, and I may have just insulted fifth graders. I'm sorry. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next time.
I want you to smash that like button.